Hi guys, welcome to part one of a two-part series on character design. We're going to be focusing on designing a couple of characters that are going to be grounded in history or grounded in reality. These are going to be tied back to the previous demos that I've done for the Foundation group. So these are going to be tied into the same world as the three-quarter room design as well as the production shot of the RPG village. So we're going to be designing a couple of characters and the costumes that go with them. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to establish a work brief. We can't really do much without a proper work brief. So one of the things that we need to establish, just like with anything else, is that we need a series of constraints. And one of the easiest ways that I found to determine what constraints are going to work or how we actually build those constraints is to be able to identify these key things, which is who, when, where, and how. That is, who are we dealing with, when is this situated, where is this situated, and how is it that they're, or why is it that they go about doing the things that they do. So, let me switch colors. We've already dealt with when and where. These are locked down to our previous demos. If you haven't seen the previous demos, I'll give a very quick recap. So we're dealing with something around the 1300s to about the 1500s. Right, that's kind of the time period that we're looking at. Where we're looking at sort of a classic European setting. So that's what we're dealing with. 1300s all the way to 1500s. We're dealing with the classic medieval period. And what we're after is classic European landscape as well. So classic European, well, let's say environment. All right, so we want this to be, we want this probably be something Germanic with a little bit of a French flavor, right? Typically when we think of Europe, we tend to think of Western Europe, which is more or less Germany and France, as well as Switzerland, Austria, a little bit of Austria, and then Italy as well. We tend to not think about Portugal or Spain. They tend to be a little bit more, so when we're considering the Iberian Peninsula, we're considering something a little bit more Mediterranean. And also when we think about Italy, even though Italy is an integral part of Europe, public culture, pop culture wise, we tend to, when we think of Italy, first thing we tend to think of is the Roman Empire first. So we don't really get that classic European feel to it. But when you think of France or you think of Germany, that's kind of the classic European flavor that most of us are a little bit more familiar with because we see a little bit more in pop culture. So we still need to answer the other two questions, which is who and how. And it says I'm actually going to change this into how and why, right? Because we want to know, how do they do this, whatever it is they need to do, and why do they do it. So the who, since we're going to be working with the idea that we're designing characters for a game, let me just shift everything across here. Most likely we're going to be dealing with soldiers, right? Soldiers or warriors. Now you might get an assignment that might come down from your art director, or if you're working freelance, they don't really want to waste star players on this, so you might get tasked with something like NPCs, support characters, and things like that. All right, that might come through. But if you're working in house, or if you're working where the team is pretty small, then the odds are you'll probably get to play around with one of the major characters or one of the major costumes. Now, in most cases, because we are dealing with entertainment, to be a little bit, I guess, I suppose a stereotype is that most of the characters that we play in games, I'd say probably like 99% of the characters that we play in games, or the characters that we follow in film or entertainment, they tend to be warriors or soldiers. So men and women of action. It's very rare that you might get a main character or a main player character that's that's a local baker, that's the local banker, or a farmer, a little dairy farmer up on the hills. It's very rare that you get that. That's like a 0.1% sort of thing. So we're going to be dealing with soldiers or warriors because that affords the most player agency in most experiences, right? That is, player agency being, giving the player or the viewer, I suppose, the feeling that they have some control over things, right? It's more fun to play people with action in a game than it is to play someone who's got to follow the rules, or someone who's heavily constrained by what they can and can't do. Now we also want to look at how and why. So the who is going to be a soldier or a warrior. How and why really is asking a question of, okay, well, how is this character, right, that we're creating, how are they able to fulfill their function? Right, what sort of soldier are they? What sort of warrior are they? And so these two kind of go hand in hand. They inform each other. So we have a soldier or warrior, and the very simple thing is, we could decide that this is a, for example, we could make him a mercenary. We could make them a part of a town watch, right, like a local guard. We can make our characters, or character, depending on how many you want to design. They could be professional soldiers. Right. So this list can go down, and this is a really fun thing. If you're doing your own project, you can kind of continue this list down and work out, which which you have the most interest in pursuing. But oftentimes, if this is for work, this will come down from your producer, or it might come down from your art director, or there might be some input for a couple of other people, right? And they'll tell you sort of what they're looking for. Your client essentially will come in and tell you, okay, we want to design for a mercenary, we want to design for a sergeant of the watch, or we want to design for a professional band of soldiers, right? And they'll generally come down and tell you exactly what they want. But if you're playing with this by yourself, you have an idea for what you'd like to create, you're trying to design your own characters, and it's pretty fun to go down and create your own list. So what I want, though, because I get to choose, because this is kind of my project, is I don't want the town watch, I don't want the professional soldier, I want the mercenary. Right? I want our character to be traveling from town to town, offering their services to the highest bidder. And so we want to start asking a question of, well, how are they going to do that? How do they travel around? How do they carry their gear? And why do they do it? So the why is pretty integral. When you're working out a character, and you're also working out the costume as well, it's not just what they look like, it's a narrative. You're trying to tell a story through the equipment that they have, through the wear and tear that it might exhibit, what they have access to, all these things. You're trying to show the personality through the costuming as well. So I want a mercenary, so I guess you could call him a professional soldier, but he's traveling from town to town, or village to village. So he's traveling through, so he's going, the idea is that he travels around, or she travels around with, I'm not sure what gender it is, but let's say this mercenary travels around, and they're they're selling their trade to the highest bidder. So that means that they have to carry everything. So they're a bit of a pack mule, right, in terms of some characteristics that we want. They're probably a little bit sentimental. So we're going to have a lot of personal effects. always forget if it's effects or effects, doesn't matter. That's personal stuff. I don't embarrass myself with bad spelling. So they're probably a little bit sentimental. They're going to have their personal stuff. And I want this person to look like, because they're kind of a pack mule, I want this to look like a one-man army. All right. So that's really important. I want this person to feel like in any situation they can kind of take care of themselves. You know, whether they need a sword or an axe or a cannon, whatever it is. I want this almost to feel like a one-man army, kind of like those one-man bands that you see. I want that sort of eclectic feel going around. And then we have to ask, you know, why are they doing this? What's actually motivating this person? So a quick motivation, it could be maybe they want revenge, maybe they're hunting something, maybe they're trying to build up enough resources to take down something in particular. In this case, what I want my mercenary to be is that they're collecting knowledge. They're going around and they're collecting knowledge. And they're collecting knowledge on beasts, right? All sorts of things, dragons, right? Manticores. Let's clean this up a little bit. You know, dragons, manticores. I don't know, maybe griffins. No eye over here. All right, so they're essentially becoming, I guess we could call it a medieval big game hunter. Right? See, medieval big game hunter. No, it's not quite right, because they're not hunting for sport. They're more hunting, I guess, for maybe, I want this person, why do I want him to be hunting around? Maybe he's hunting for power. Maybe there are some vital ingredients in these dragons and manticores that's going to give him power. Maybe, what else could he be hunting for? I guess revenge could work. His village, his home was wiped out by, you know, these creatures. So he's after revenge. I suppose it's not too bad. I think the original one, the Big Game Hunter one, works the best. So the Big Game Hunter one kind of gives a sense of maybe pride or arrogance to this character. So maybe they're a little bit of a peacock in terms of showing off. So a little bit of show off. So as I'm working this out, and right now I have no visuals whatsoever, everything is text, but I'm slowly trying to flesh out a character that is going to be quite interesting for me to deal with. All right, for me to start designing for. Because if there's none of this, if there's no personality in terms of, if I don't know what they do as a profession, if I don't know some of the key characteristics behind this person, if I don't know why they're doing things, right? So this is the why. If I don't know why they're doing things, then it's very hard. I'll end up designing something that's quite generic, something that's quite boring. And that's definitely something that you don't want with a character. So this is a rough, sort of very rough cursory breakdown of what sort of character I want. As I continue this through, all of this is going to evolve. All of this is going to, we're going to add on more and more layers to make this character more interesting. And right now, this is what I have. And as I start designing more and I start researching more, I have a better idea. So this is, I suppose we could call this step one. So step one really is, what the hell am I doing? That's what it's really after. What am I doing? What am I creating? And so on. So following on from that, we've obviously got step 2. And step 2 then is research. Now, before I get to step 2, I want to talk about a couple of things. So I'm going to drag step 2 down here. But before I get to step 2, I want to talk about a couple of things first. It's very easy sometimes to conflate character design with illustration. Illustrations are beautiful. They show a character in action. They show a world with a lot of vibrancy, with a lot of life. Character design is actually kind of boring, because when you design your character, no matter what that character is going to be, this section of what you design is going to fit inside a pipeline. So if you imagine an entire pipeline from start to end, so this is nothing, and then this is the game in the shop. When you design your character, or you design a prop, you design a room or an environment, it fits in very early on at the start of the production cycle. So if you're a professional and you're working, you already you know all this, so it's not very important. But if you are a student and you are learning, it's very important to understand that, you know, at the end of the day, this is still a business. So what we do fits in at the very, very early stages of the production of a game or a film. And we need to make sure that whatever we create here is legible for the person down the line, that they have enough, I suppose, material to work with, that they can then pass it down to someone further down the line and so forth, right, until it gets all the way to the end. And each point, right, each of these intervals, a specialist comes in and does their magic in order for this to keep going down. So that means that if our specialists are probably within the context of, I suppose, the art department, our specialists would include people like the 3D artist. They would, oops, forgot the I. They would include animators. They're also going to include sound engineers. They're probably also going to, you know, we can start to get, let me move the sound guy over here. But we can also get into, you know, a couple of more nitty-gritty details. So we might have a texture artist. Right, we might have a whole bunch of other people in between, right? But in order for our product to get all the way to the end, each person comes in and brings in their specialization to add a little bit more to the whole project, so that you go from, you know, a rough drawing all the way to the very end, where you have essentially, you know, your game sitting on the shelf or on Steam or whatever it is. Right, it's got to go from a crappy sort of, you know, drawing all the way to a full three-dimensional experience. If something were to happen along the way, it holds everything up. So if a mistake was to happen here, that means that all these guys back here are sitting around doing nothing, waiting for this problem to get resolved. So it's your job as a concept artist, because you do come in quite early, whether you're doing characters, costumes, environments, props, and so on. It's quite important for you to make sure that you provide as much information as you can, so that the 3D artist knows how to build whatever it is that you've designed, that the animators know how to rig and then animate whatever it is that you've designed, that the texture artists know what's going on, and that the sound guys know what's going on as well. You want to make sure that you provide as much information as you can. Now, obviously, you can't provide 100% of the information, because some things are going to change. Engine could change, resources could change, so on. So, but you try and aim for as much or as close to 100% as you can, so that you create as smooth of a working environment as possible. And so this leads to the original point I was going to make, which is what I'm trying to make, which is it's very easy to confuse illustration with concept art or design work. Design work, whether it's particularly for characters, it's very, very boring. It's not the flashy sort of design or piece where you see a hero, like let's say something from Assassin's Creed, jumping through the air and then diving into a crowd to take out whoever it is that they're supposed to assassinate. What you end up with, rather than that cool image, if you're doing a design, is you end up with something very, very basic. All right, most likely you're going to end up with a pretty boring pose, right? Probably a neutral, almost front view, but kind of three-quarter view. You're going to end up with another one. So this would be for the front, back, and then you might have a side view, and then you might have an arm sort of cut out. So very basic orthographics, right? So you might have something like this, or if it's kind of early stages, then what you might end up with in terms of what's expected of you might be just very simple sort of classic hero poses with a little bit of personality, just a slight little bit of personality thrown in of whatever characters that or designs that you're trying to sell. In this case, I guess these are kind of almost like pseudo Superman when they're power poses. And they're very basic in terms of there's no real intricate posing, or there's no real sort of, I suppose, dynamism in these sort of images, and that's actually for a reason. You want to make sure that whoever is looking at this, whether it's your art director, whether it's your producer, or whether it's other people in your team, right, that when they're looking at this, they know exactly what you're trying to represent, so that when you design this, they know what's going on. You're not hiding anything. So if you don't, for example, if you don't know how to draw hands and you're designing this sort of very intricate sort of looking glove that's integral to the design of your character, then you better bloody well work out how to draw hands, right? So you can put a glove over it. Because if you don't, and you try and hide it, what's going to happen is if this goes into production, the 3D artist is going to come back and is going to go, hey, remember when you designed this thing, what exactly does the hand look like? Because you kind of hid it behind something. The animators are going to come back and go, hey, how exactly does this hand move? Does it just move like a normal hand, or is there some mechanism behind it? All right, so you want to make sure that when you design this stuff, it's as explicit as possible for your 3D artists, for your animators, for your texture artists, for your sound people, and so on. So in most cases, you'll have something like this, and what happened is your AD producer or your team is going to look at it. They're probably, or your client, they're probably going to pick, if we call this 1, 2, and 3, they might pick 1 or 2 of them, and you might refine it a little bit, and then ultimately you're going to end up with a orthographic drawing explaining everything out, where you have everything lined up, right, so people know exactly what's going on effectively with the image. And let's say if there's a bag, oh, that's the back view. Let's say if there's a bag that goes over the chest or something, then you might have another shot of exactly what does that bag look like, and then what's behind that bag, what actually goes behind it. And then your 3D artists or your animators, etc., they're going to come back and they'll, using their expertise, work out, can I make this as one, or do I need to make it as 2 different assets? Do we have the resources to make it as 2 different assets, etc., etc. Right? But you're leaving this part, or you're leaving that expertise to the experts, and you're trying to produce or provide to them as much information as possible. It's really important to remember. I've with a lot of students that I've taught, the biggest issue that they run into when they get to do characters, they get really excited, right? And I see them pumped full of energy. They get this great idea, so they do step 1 really well, right? They have this entire page, almost like a thesis written about what sort of character is, all the personality. That's great. You know, fantastic foundation. And then what they do is they come back with this beautiful illustration of, you know, let's say they want to do some sort of, you know, mech pilot. And they do this beautiful illustration of this mech pilot sort of chilling maybe in the cockpit of whatever it is, you know, of the robot. Oops, looking kind of weird. And they, you know, let's get some extreme foreshortening on this thing. They design all this stuff out. The hand, the helmet is all there. They designed this beautiful thing out, and as an illustration piece, it looks great. It looks fantastic. And oftentimes these guys, you know, a lot of students I have, they paint way better than I can. They draw way better than I can as well. And there's some really beautiful stuff. But they come back with this, and immediately, as good as this is, as amazing as this is, it's not usable. You might be able to use it for marketing later on. It might come in at the end for marketing, or it might come in sort of more as a, if I switch to a different color, let's go blue. It might work really well as sort of an umbrella piece that goes over here to inspire, right? To inspire the team or to keep things going. But what it doesn't do very well is it doesn't really provide the 3D artist with enough information of what exactly does this leg look like. This knee over here, because of foreshortening, is hiding something back there, right? It's difficult for the animators to know, well, what actually moves in this, right? For the texture artists to know what materials and so on. I mean, the sound guy probably, you know, be able to work out, okay, well, you know, this is going to make whatever noise, but they're still limited because things are kind of blocked off. So this happens a lot, and something that you want to be aware of when you're designing a character. Your job is to make sure that you provide enough information, or as much as possible, so that this path going down moves as smoothly as possible. Now, of course, things are always going to interfere. Whether you're working in-house or you're working for a client as a freelancer, something's always going to happen. It could be that the budget dropped, right? So the money went down, or it could be that the budget went up, and so you know, now you get to add more things back in that previously you couldn't have. So you got to go back and revisit certain things. It could be that they decide halfway through the engine that they were using is now out of date, or there's some dispute with licensing and they have to use a brand new engine. So these things are always going to happen, and they're always going to interfere with the development cycle. But your job is to make sure that you try, at least with your part, make sure that you cover as many bases as you can, so that everything is nice and smooth. So whatever happens, you can always step back and go, hey, I did everything that was reasonable for me to do. Right? I covered all my bases. I don't like to think of it as sort of covering your own ass. I like to more think of it as just making sure that you've provided everybody with everything that they might need. There's always going to be little things that people are going to come back and ask questions of, but the main things, you know, the broader strokes you've covered, right? And it's only the tiny nitty-gritty things like, oh, with this belt, what sort of buckle do you want? You know, do you have a preference for a buckle? Those little things like that aren't too much of a worry. But if people are coming back going like, what is this? Is this a foot, or is this like a peg leg? And if it's unclear, then that's a problem. So that's really important when you're doing character design or costume design, that whatever it is that you've created is I suppose as explicit as possible. And by doing this, it allows your art director, producer to be able to make more informed decisions as well. So they're not having to guess either, of thinking, well, I think this is what it might look like. What you're showing them is as close as possible to the real thing. All right, so with character design, there's one thing as well that a lot of my students forget, and this thing, you know, trips me up as well from time to time. It's very easy when we're dealing with an environment shot. Let's go back and do our environment. And of course, we want to remember we have our foreground over here, we have our midground over here, and then we have our background in the middle to get some parallaxing. And this time, rather than a dragon, let's do a big house. Oops. Let's do some snow-capped mountains, spiky snow-capped mountains in the back. It's easy when we're dealing with an environment to remember foreground, midground, background. It's easy to for us to remember when we're doing a 3/4 room, or when we're doing some form of prop. It's easy for us to remember under these circumstances the idea of large, medium, and small, right? Tying back to ideas of foreground, midground, and background. Keep pressing the wrong hotkey. It's easy for us to remember these things, right? Because it's just, for whatever reason, because we're used to dealing with products, I'm assuming, it's just a lot easier for us to really understand this sort of stuff, or to intrinsically know to think in that particular way. But we also need to remember that when we're dealing with characters, we need to think the same thing. We need to consider ideas of large, medium, and small. And this is also reflected in our high to low density, our high to low density arrangement as well. Again, like I said, it's a very simple thing, and it's very easy to miss. But if you are able to incorporate this into your designs, whether it's an environment, an isometric view, or a prop, a vehicle, whatever it is, if you can incorporate this, it will make your designs that much stronger. So we have to remember that when we're dealing with a character, so let's take one of our, what was it? Let's take one of our superhero-like characters. So it's not so, so it's a little closer to what our final product is going to be. I'm struggling a little bit with my Photoshop for some reason. Ever since I changed nibs, I replaced an old nib with a new one, and ever since I did that, I find the keys, they kind of get stuck. It gets really sticky for some reason. I just haven't had the time to look too into it. But if you see the keys stick a little bit, that's the reason why. So we have our character here. It's very important to remember that we need to apply all these things over to this. It's not just about drawing a cool character, it's about thinking our large, medium, and small elements. So I'm going to use this example. I'm going to pick something very, very classic. Since it's kind of got the Superman pose already, let's overlay this with the idea of Superman. Right? And we can see, the idea of large, medium, and small, high, low density. So classic idea of image of Superman has the giant S on his chest. Right? Doesn't matter how far back you go with Superman, it's the iconic look of having the S on the chest. There's also the other iconic look, which is the wrestling trunks that go, the underpants on the outside sort of thing. And then he has a belt, which is often easily forgotten, but the belt is actually quite important. Because what the belt does is actually creates a spot of color. In that the belt, the color for the belt is this bright yellow, which ties back in with the crest on his chest. And of course he's got boots. this, and then he has a cape. You can make the argument that the S-curl for his hair is another element. But if we look at this now and we kind of break this down, we can see, if I switch to another color again, let's pick an orange. We can see, well, orange is not good. It's a little bit too close to our red. Let's go with, let's say a green over here. It's a little bit, this green. This camera green is a little easier to see. We have an area of high density over here. Right, so that handles our high density. The rest of the area around it is really all low density. We have an area, again, an area of high density with the belt, and you can make the argument that along with the face, a little bit of the hair, again, we have sort of high density. So this is high density, high density, high density. The boots, the restless trunks, we can make the argument that that's medium density. And finally, the rest of the blue on his costuming, as well as the red on the cape, they form really large flat fields of color. They go back to our low density as well. Right, so you have a nice separation between low and high density. We've also made sure that as far as low and high density goes, we have less, in terms of we have less high density in terms of area coverage than we do of low density, so that it balances out. We can also look at this from a large, medium, and small point of view. And again, we have large areas of empty space. We have medium areas, right, of space, and then we have small areas of space. Right? So it's a nice separation going through this this entire design. And you can apply this. Superheroes are a really good example because superheroes are designed to be iconic in that they're designed to be walking icons. And icons have to be easily read, easily seen from afar. And particularly with the rate of production for comic books, they always have to be easily drawn as well. So comic book characters are a great example. You could try this for Batman. You can try this for Shazam. You can try it for, you can try for the. Actually, a really good example is you look at X-Men. If you look at the designs for the X-Men, as colorful and as strange as its costumes got, you know, if you go all the way back to the original X-Men and you follow it through all the different runs, you know, through into the more modern runs, and you see the evolution of the costumes, as crazy as they get sometimes, they still follow this basic rule, and that's what makes a lot of these characters iconic. Some of the characters that are not as popular, some of the characters that are not as well liked, typically will have costumes that are a little bit more confusing, or that don't really quite work. So on the DC side, one example could be Wildcat. If you have the time, you can go Google Wildcat as a character. It's not a very interesting costume, so it's not as iconic or it's not as memorable as the other secondary characters. If you compare, let's say, Wildcat and Booster Gold, right? Booster has more similar elements in terms of the design separation that Superman has, and that makes it visually a little bit more iconic. Whereas with Wildcat, it really is just a level of high density along the mask, and then the rest is a single color. So you don't get this nice distribution of high-low density. You don't get your large, medium, and smalls. You really just get small, and then the rest is just flat. Even a character like Batman, which is meant to be very dark, it runs exactly the same design. So if let's scrub this out. I'll do another example. Let's go back to our blue. So if you take a character like Batman, you have the logo in the middle on the chest, which forms a nice high density point. You have the cowl. Right. We're not even talking about silhouettes, we're just talking about right now high-low density separation and large, medium, and smalls. Because of the way the cowl works, it creates a high density point with a contrast between the face, his jaw, and the cowl itself. Batman's utility belt. While Batman doesn't wear the wrestling trunks that let's say Superman has, but Batman generally sports a rather chunky utility belt. So again, we get another area of high density. And then don't forget, Batman, unlike Superman, has gloves. And so that's where we start to get, and often they'll be illustrated where they're slightly different colors than the rest of the suit. And he's got his boots as well, but this is where we start to get our medium points of density. And of course, he has his cape as well. You can apply this to most of the, well, not for a better way of wording it, most of the top tier superheroes or supervillains will have this sort of breakdown. And that's what makes them visually arresting when we walk past something. This is what makes characters like Superman, Batman, Iron Man, Captain America, Spider-Man, this is what makes them memorable. Right? It's the story plays a big role, the silhouettes play a big role, but this sort of, at the fundamental level, this idea of high-low density distribution, large mutant soul, this is what allows it to work quite well. So, very important to remember these things. Our job is not to do a really cool illustration, although when if we're called to do it, that is fantastic. It's a lot of fun. It's very rewarding artistically. But as far as production goes, this is not what typically a client is after if they're asking for a design. They want something a little closer to this, something that's going to fit into the production pipeline that will allow them to essentially continue down this production line and end up with a final product, because we treat this as a labor of love. We treat this as a artistic or creative endeavor. But let's not forget, at the end of the day, this is a business, and that means money. So the less hiccups you cause, the more money that your potential clients are going to make. So don't forget that. Second is, just because we're now dealing with characters, we don't want to forget our foreground, background, and midground, our large, medium, small elements. Right? All of these things, right? All of this over here, high-low density, large, medium, so all of this, if you can think of it as composition. Except rather than composition through a lens, so looking through a camera, we're now dealing with composition that falls onto a character itself, right? So this is where the fashion people have sort of a leg up on us, in that their understanding of treating the human body as a canvas and then composing garments on top. They have, they're much better at us than, in terms of understanding this than we are. But their design may not be sort of, because they're thinking a little bit more practical. They're thinking, how would this garment look in the real world? Whereas we're dealing with it in, how is this going to look on a character that you get to, that you're running around on the screen, right? That's ducking behind cover and everything, that you might have a UI sort of, a HUD or, a radar, that sort of thing. With also, we're thinking about this, but they're thinking about, in real life, right, in the world, how's this going to work? But we need to adapt it to this sort of thing. All right, so that was a little bit of segue in terms of a couple of things that, through my experience, I found that a lot of students fall into the trap of. Certainly, again, I fall into this trap many times. If I'm a little bit tired and I'm not bothering to think things through, I tend to fall into this trap as well. And it's very hard to get out of it. Right? Once you're in, it's really, really hard to get out, because you spend all this time sort of doing this beautiful piece, and then suddenly you find out you can't use it. It's heartbreaking to kind of let go. So you try and kind of salvage this thing, but you just realize in the end it's just not worth the time and the money. Right? You can literally keep this for fun and then start something else. Redo this in the proper format. Right? Or if it's your composition is not quite right, redo the entire composition, and you actually end up working a lot faster, and you might end up with a better design as well, because you've had time to reflect. So now I still have step 2, research, but before I get to that again, so I'm going to keep bumping this down, I'm going to talk a little bit about my process as well, so you know what's going to be coming up ahead. actually, let's call it something else. Let's call it a checklist. I want to call it a checklist because one of the things I firmly believe in is that when you start working on a project, when you start doing anything, actually any sport, whatever it is, we call this time, we call this your energy. As you start doing something, when you start doing something, your energy levels are really, really high. You got a lot of enthusiasm, you got a lot of motivation, you're really gung-ho to get something done. And as you progress through, you spend more time on something, your energy levels start to drop, right? Because it could be, if we break this down very quickly, this could be the first hour, second, third, fourth, and fifth. And naturally you get more tired as you move along, so your energy drops. As it drops, you start to forget things and you start to leave things out. So one way that I found to combat this is essentially creating a checklist, so that as I move along this time scale, because I have this handy list with me, almost like a shopping list, right? I have to think less and less. That means that I can then just focus on one thing at a time moving through and just making sure that one thing is done really well. So every project that I do, I always create a checklist. Every piece that I design or that I create, I always create a checklist because I feel that it's incredibly important. It also means that if I have to stop work, let's say here, 3 hours in, and I have to move to another project, and then I'm only able to get back to this 2 days later, I can always refer back to my checklist to find out exactly, oh, I was right here. Okay, this is what I have left to do. If I rely on my memory, if you rely on your memory too much, then you might find that, yeah, for maybe a day or two, if you come back to it, you're still pretty fresh, you know what you need to do. But what if you had a pretty big project and that actually delayed you by 1 week? Do you think after 1 week, if you come back, will you actually remember everything? Maybe if you're young, you might remember 70% of what you need to do, but I'm a little older now, so I think probably after a week, I'd only remember about 40% of what I was supposed to do. So just having this list is quite useful. It means that it also allows me to juggle multiple pieces or multiple projects at the same time, and I won't feel overwhelmed either. So the first thing as a general checklist that I need to do once I've set this out, so let's plan everything. So the first one is our work brief. So that's our constraint. So we've got that done. The second part then is research. So that includes finding reference images. And something that everybody forgets or doesn't do is you have to read about it. If this is a subject matter that is grounded in history or that is grounded in some form of reality, you need to read about it. If you are designing motorcycles, you need to understand how a motorcycle works. You don't need to know everything, but you need to have some idea of how the brakes works, why the engine is placed in a particular way, and so on. So a lot of people always forget this. They forget to read, they forget to do their research. They find a whole bunch of pictures and that's it. They don't quite understand why things are done in a certain way. And finally, we want to curate it. That is, we want to take our reference image and we want to curate it into something that's useful. So what we don't want is a whole bunch of random images. This is not it's not like a dream board or anything. We don't want this. This is not something that we want. What we do want, and I'll walk you guys through this later on, is we want a nice clean reference image. And that might mean that you end up with, let's say, 3 or 4 or however many, but you want a nice clean reference image, nice clean reference board, which might have the title of the project. It might have some keywords that that you're using to remind yourself what it's about. And then you have your images, again thinking back to our large, medium, and small. We want our reference images to be arranged in the same way. And that creates a hierarchy as well with our references. So we know what is the most important reference on this page, what is the second most important, and what is finally the least important. So it shows a decision-making process. It shows that you're already designing by curating that work. And it may very well be that you have one page on, let's say, if we're doing, in this case, we're doing a mercenary, so I might have one page on just the face. I might have another page on accessories, right? I might have another page on weapons. And I can also have a page on mood. What do I want this to feel like? What's the mood of the entire character, and so on. So this can, this can go on quite a bit. In the workplace, this is probably something that your clients will never see, and this is probably something that they don't need to see. If you're in a studio, your art director may want to see it just to double check, but generally this is something that your art director is going to be passing to you rather than you passing up to your art director, right? Or it might be something that your seniors are handling and they're passing it down to you. But generally, if you're doing freelancing work or as a student, this stuff, no one's really going to see it. No one's really going to care about it, because what they're after is this final image. But you have to do this in order to get there, right? In order for this to be coherent, you need to have this. Right? Maybe not exactly laid out like this, but you need to curate the work that you have. Once I have my research done, I don't jump in and draw straight away. I want to create thumbnails. I want to create thumbnails to check for my large, medium, and small. I also want to use this to check my shapes, right? My silhouettes. Does the silhouette look interesting? Does the shapes or the this is also density. Does it work, right? Or is it too much? Is it too bland, or is it too busy? So we're trying to work this out. Because one thing to remember is with these iconic designs, with these iconic characters, you want to make sure that it works as a small thumbnail. If it doesn't work as a small thumbnail, then it doesn't matter how big you enlarge that design, it's not really going to work. Because if you really think about it, and we're designing for a game in this case, when you're looking at a screen, we do have really our screens are getting bigger and bigger, but if you think, even if you're sitting at, let's say, let's give a nice example. Let's say you've got a nice, let's say you got a nice maybe 39 to 42 inch TV, right? Or okay, let's use TV for now. You have a 39 or 42 inch TV. It's a pretty big TV. The distance that you're sitting back, sort of on your couch, probably hunched over, because that's inevitably the posture that everybody ends up with if you're playing on a console. Hunched over, you're probably looking at about anywhere between 2 to 3 meters, right? I'd imagine around 2 to 3 meters. At that scale, the character that you're looking at on screen is going to be pretty small. So let's say even the character takes up half the screen, so you can see where your enemies are. If you look at from your field of view, because you're probably going to catch elements around your TV as well, around your living room, you're probably only, like, in terms of your field of vision, the character is probably still in your center of focus, but it's probably going to be pretty small. So you want to make sure that visually, amongst all the noise of the big explosions happening on screen, right, enemies shooting at you, explosions, lasers, everything, within that, you want to make sure that this character is iconic enough that is its shape language, its high, medium, small, sorry, it's large, medium, small, it's high, low density, that it reads well. If you think about this in the context of, let's say you're at your desk, whether you have a laptop, let's say you kind of splurge a little bit, you got a 17-inch laptop, or if you have a monitor, and let's say you've got a 24-inch monitor, and you're sitting here playing a game, again, you're probably looking at something very similar to this in terms of how much your character takes up. So you want to make sure that if it works small, it's definitely going to work big. But if it only works big, it may not go backwards, right? And if it doesn't work here, it's definitely not going to work when you make it larger. So we'll go through thumbnails, and then it's only after thumbnails that we might do some sketches. Now sketching, this is really important, does not mean bad drawings. When we're trying to sketch, what we're doing is we're taking our thumbnails and we're just expanding on those thumbnails to refine them a little bit more to see if they still work. It's almost like an intermediate step between getting to the final product. We want to make sure that it works on this step, right? They're starting to come together. But sketching, or a sketch, doesn't mean it's a bad drawing, doesn't mean that it's a rush drawing. It doesn't mean that either. It just means a looser developmental drawing that's an intermediate step before we get to the final thing. And then finally, we have our, let me just erase this. Get rid of this so it's not in the way. Then we have our clean line work. And this is typically where you might create let me get some more space. Again, really cool thing about working digitally is that you have free paper. Real estate goes on forever. Where you might do some, 3 or 4. I generally work in groups of 3, so if I do a second page, it'll be 6. But you do some nice clean line work, explicitly showing your design, and then your client can kind of pick which one that they want. They're like, oh, you know what, I like this one. Or let's say, if we use like a real example, let's grab this. The client might say, let's erase this, let's say these are, that's up to 3, so 4, 5, and 6. They might say, you know what, I really like number 2, so this one is definitely one we want to pick. But can we do one where we have number 6's torso, but number 1's sort of lower body? But I want it in the pose of, can you do it quickly in the pose of number 5, right? So it's not to mix and match, but essentially, effectively what you're doing is you're giving your client options. You're showing them possibilities. Never forget, you're the specialist here. So you're coming in with your specialization, with your knowledge, and you're providing this essential service so that it helps your client make an informed decision about what they want to do. And then if there is time, sometimes depending on what the outcome is, if it's something a little bit more filmic, then you might, that's why you might paint it. It might be a photo finish, or it could be a render, like a rendering. It might be some, there might be a little bit of stylizing involved. Right, so, but that's the final sort of outcome, and that typically is like, we're going to go with this one, and then you'll do a sort of a nice, a nice sort of larger, really well polished image. Of the design. And then typically accompanying that is probably going to be your orthographics, right? Your standard sort of T-poses. That sort of stuff. As these two together, and if you pass to a 3 artist, they'll love you for it. Because you're giving them all the information, and then they can lather on their magic to make this come alive. But if you're giving them scribbles, they're gonna hate you, because what effectively you're doing is you're handing off your job to them. So now they have to do your job to be able to do their job. So that's the overall checklist that kind of runs through my workflow process. Each section in here is going to have its own I guess subcategory of a checklist. So if I'm doing a silhouette, for example, if I'm doing my thumbnails, then that's going to have a, that's probably going to break down into, things like the poses that I pick. It might be the shape language I decide on, and this list can go down in terms of what I need to double check, like double check the pose, double check the shape language, double check the high low density, and so on. And so that's going to go through. All right, so that's I suppose that's part one of part one, or step one of part one. And now let's move to step two, which is going to be the research phase. So I'm going to walk you guys through at this point how I actually go about using or creating my reference boards. I've already gathered all my reference images, and they're in a big file, which is a little bit messy, and I'm going to arrange them in such a way to show you guys how you can make heads or tails out of your references, so you're not dealing with sort of this smorgasbord of just images with no particular hierarchy. Alright guys, so here is some references that I've gone ahead and created. So I'm going to zoom out so you can see all of them. In this case, because we're just doing a single character, I've only gone ahead and just created three reference boards. Now, the bigger your project, the more of these you're going to have. Now we're just simply doing a single character at this stage, so this is more than enough. If you want to go more detailed than this, then that's great. And I would always advise that as a student, you should definitely have more of this practice, because what a reference board allows you to do is that it helps it helps to curate your ideas and to help curate the references that you've collected. It's really important to remember as well why we want this curation. We want this curation because otherwise we end up essentially with just sort of a folder with thousands of pictures tucked away inside. And the problem with that is when you're trying to find something, if you've got all these pictures inside, it's almost impossible to find what you want. So you end up only using about, I dare say around 10 to 20% of all the images you collect. Forcing yourself to curate it into design boards like these or reference boards like these is quite helpful, because then you actually go through, and even though let's say you only do end up using, let's say 10 to 20, you'll know that's 10 to 20% of the best pieces inside your reference folder. So the way that I've broken this down, and I do this for all my projects, is that I won't just create one page of references. I'll try and break it down into subjects. So in the first one over here, this is the overall feel that I'm going for this character. What should this character at a glance feel like? And in this case, if we look at it a little bit closer, I want this to feel a little bit heavier. I want this to feel that whatever they have is well worn, because they're a mercenary. This is their profession, right? So if this is their profession, they're going to be very comfortable with it. It's almost whatever armor they have is going to be well worn, but it's going to feel like it's almost like like your favorite pair of jeans. It's probably pretty old, but it has that perfect fit just from use over time. The second image, or the second page that I have, is specifically looking at just the armor and what I'm trying to get from it. So very quickly, in this case, what I like, or what I would like to achieve to get that sort of well-worn sort of feel, is composite materials and different materials. I didn't want a full suit of armor. What I wanted was elements like these where, for example, here we have, a leather strap, we have chainmail, we have padding, and we have, again, some more leather padding, and then we also have over here, metal plates for the breastplate over here. But you got all these different materials, and what I'm trying to picture is, with those materials, as your character moves, the sound that they might make, the movements that might be interesting. So if we take a look at this sort of guy over here, you can imagine that this being a little bit more secure, right? The breastplate and the shoulder guard, that when he moves, this might stay still, but the chainmail underneath might scratch or might make some noises, and then the fabric, the padding underneath, that's going to move very differently as well. So when you visually look at it, you've got all these different textures moving along or working in conjunction with each other, and it creates a really nice sort of rich tapestry of of the costume that the character might have. It's also pretty cool. You can imagine if the way that this character walks, let's say this excess of a belt, it might slap against his thigh. There might be some rattling with some of the elements over here. Or even over here, this sort of water bottle or this sort of flask is going to be hitting against his leg while he walks, and you get some really nice, interesting sounds as well. Because don't forget, games are not just purely visual. There's quite a bit of audio components through a game as well. So you'd want to make it both visually interesting as well as interactively interesting, and you also want to make it audibly interesting as well, so it's not too dull. So this one is looking at predominantly the armor, what our character might be wearing, and then finally this is weapons and equipment. So in this case, I do want a little bit of sort of this early gunpowder. Right, so at this stage, they're not using cannonballs that we're familiar with. They're using really just rocks that they can shove into this. But it's also looking at the design that they might have of backpacks, this idea of the size of some of the padding they might have underneath. There's really cool sort of large shields. Again, little knickknacks, because earlier on we talked about our mercenary or our character carrying essentially their life story on them. And that means they're probably going to have, equipment like a wicker basket. Again, this sort of medieval backpack brace. That's kind of interesting. Little pouches like this. And these will go on to inform sort of the little details that I want on my character in terms of the weapons and equipment. Now, this page, any of these sections, whether we're dealing with armor, whether we're dealing with weapons and equipment, right, or even the overall feel, they don't have to be just limited to one page. They can be done. Whoops. They can be done over several pages. Right? So it doesn't mean that you have to have everything on one page. You can split it across into page 1, page 2, page 3, and so forth. So when I worked at FZD Films, one of the things we did for the bigger projects was that we actually ended up with pages and pages of these reference boards, and each one targeting a very specific area of whatever section of the film we're working on, or the character they're working on. They'll have their own reference sheets, and that just means that oftentimes when you're working, whether you're in-house or working freelance, you may not see your work from start to finish. It might be that halfway through you stop and it gets passed on to somebody else, and then they deal with whatever it is that they need to deal with, and it might come back to you. Now this could be for a whole gamut of reasons. It could be that it needs to be passed off to a specialist, right, or it could be that you've got other work that you need to do, right, that is your specialization, and then eventually you've got to hand it off to someone else. Having design boards like these, it means that if you need to pass this on to someone else, they are referencing back to the same reference material that you're using. Or alternatively, if you're sitting in here and you're getting work fed into you, any questions, any queries you might have, you're both, so let's say from the originating artist, you're both pulling from the same source. And that means that any potential miscommunication between the two of you, or sometimes it actually is, multiple people, any miscommunication is therefore minimized. let's go ahead and clean up some of this, and I'll talk a little bit more about how I structure my reference images. Because reference images is not just about finding all these pictures and putting them together. I talked a little bit earlier about when we're designing a character or an environment or a prop and so on, we often have elements of large, medium, and small. Now obviously, large being the biggest thing, generally we infer that this is the #1 priority. Medium being the second biggest thing, we infer that that's the second priority, and small being at the bottom is our third priority. So when we set up our design board, sorry, our reference board, I've done exactly the same thing. I've established my large, medium, and small. Here's my large. Here are my mediums. And then here is my small. I've done the exact same thing. Now what I'm trying to instigate, or what I'm trying to achieve here, is that this is my primary reference, or I suppose my hero reference. This is my hero reference for the overall feel. Now this has been pulled from, I believe, I think it's a Discovery Channel documentary, or sort of one of their sort of half fiction, half non-fiction series that they do, where they intersplice reenactments with interviews or something. I think this is where this is from, but this is not. This is definitely from a something. I think either it could be a documentary from the BBC, or it could be from the Discovery Channel. But this is from film, right? Effectively, this is from film. But I want this particular feel to sort of bleed out into the rest of the images here. I want this idea of someone wearing something quite heavy. Right? I want this time period, or this character. I want this time period to reflect in the character, which is they don't have thin materials that we have today. They don't have really well-designed or well-machined equipment that we have access to today. But what they do have is something quite heavy, something quite rugged, quite sturdy. I like this sort of shape, right, that it's cutting. It's almost sort of this monolithic shape. Right? And that's the overall feeling that I want from when you see this character. My medium-sized references on the right-hand side, so collected together in a group of 3, is again trying to reference, okay, well, this is the overall feel, and I still want this to come through, but I'm picking 3 separate images, and each of these has this powerful feeling to it. Right? Same thing that this image has, in terms of you're getting this very monolithic, very powerful sort of silhouette that comes through with these characters. Right? And each of these visually are quite different, in that you have someone with sort of, you know, there's plate armor mixed in with fabrics. There's sort of this plate armor underneath, overlaid with, you know, this decorative, I guess, garment, and then you have the classic sort of full plate Gothic armor over here. Now, time-wise, these are actually a little bit different in terms of where they sit on a scale. If I name this 1, 2, and 3, so 1 and 3 are probably a little bit closer in timeline, and then later on you get equipment or armor that's a little closer to number 2. But the key thing for me that I'm trying to sell in this sense is that I just want the overall feel, and so I just want that sense of power to come through. My smaller references down here, right, they're just kind of, you know, emphasizing whatever's going on up here or up here. These are designed just to support these reference images, that, you know, my large or medium reference images. And then over here, generally what I do is I try and list out 3 keywords and a couple of notes as well. Right? And the main reason why I do that is, again, I might start this, let's say, Monday, right, for work. I start doing this, but because of other things that interfere or that might get in the way, other things that need to get done, I may not come back and visit this until, let's say, you know, it could be, I might not get the chance until Friday afternoon, and there's a big gap between Monday morning and Friday afternoon, so I might forget a couple of things in between. So having down some of these keywords, having down some of these notes is going to be quite helpful. Alright, so the keywords, I tried to not go over 3. Now you can have it as 1 or 2, doesn't really matter, but I kind of limit it at 3 just to make it a little bit easier. 3 or less is fine. In my opinion, 3 or less is fine. So one of the keywords, the first one is I needed this to feel heavy. I need this to feel well worn. So this is a piece of equipment that, or whatever they're wearing, it needs to look like this person has almost grown into whatever it is that they're using, whatever it is they look like, the armor that they have. This is not brand new. And it has to look like they trust in the equipment that they have. This one's a little bit harder to kind of convey, but I need my mercenary, I need my soldier, my character to look like they know what they're doing and they trust in their equipment, they trust in whatever it is that they're using. So some of the elements here is just to know, it says, okay, I want to make sure that we can see that the life story is worn on this character, that their equipment, it might be worn out, but it still looks very durable and very solid. And I want them to look very slow and purposeful, and that leads into that heaviness again, right? Even though they might be heavy and slow, they move with purpose. So when I design this character, I want that feeling. And so this is really what I'm describing here. Now, right at this stage, I've got 2 references that are from entertainment sources already. So I have my primary reference here, and obviously have Ronin the Accuser down here, which come from entertainment sources. I try and, for most of my work, source about an 80 to 20 split with my references. That means that I try to keep 80% of my references to be real, and then at most 20% of my references might come from other entertainment sources. And the reason why I do this is when you look at stuff from entertainment, where you look at stuff, let's say, you know, Ronin over here, you might be able to pull out certain cultural designs or certain design elements. You might be able to trace back where they came from, but you're only really guessing. Because when you're looking at this, you only see what the designer's final intent is. You don't know how many steps removed this design is from the original. Let's say this is the original source, and then let's say this is where they get to you know, the final outcome of Ronin. You don't know how many steps back, right, how many iterations they had to go through to be able to get to Ronin. So you don't know how far back you need to go to get to the original source. You might have an inkling, you might say, okay, maybe it's about there, or it could be there, or it could be there, but you don't really know. So I try to rely on entertainment references as little as possible, and I mostly try and rely on real life references so that I'm now in control with how many steps removed I am when I'm designing from the original source material. Because if you go too far away from the original source material, it gets very confusing for your audience, because there's no frame of reference. If you create everything from scratch, it's very hard for an audience to relate to it. One of the best examples that I used to use a lot was Jupiter's Ascending. There's a lot of really beautiful designs in the movie, but a lot of it is really out there. And if you're sitting down and you're in the right mood, then it's incredibly interesting. And there's a lot of stuff for you to sink your teeth into and really just kind of, you know, take in that culture that's been designed into Jupiter's Ascending. But if you're just a common audience and, you know, let's say you're going out on a Friday night, you want to catch a movie, grab, you know, after getting some drinks or getting a meal, you know, with your partner or with your friends, you're probably not in the mood for that. Right? You're in the mood to be entertained. And the way that I tend to view things is that, you know, our job as concept artists, or our job as purveyors of entertainment, is that we are here to do the work for people. We're here to do the work for the audience, so we provide them with a fun and enjoyable experience. If you've been working all through the week, right, so you're here and you've been working all through a week to get to Friday, and you've worked very hard to accumulate the money, you know, through the week, you want to make sure that on the Friday night or a Saturday night, and you go spend your money and you go out and you go watch a movie, that you're entertained, right? You don't want to work for that experience. You want that experience to be already packaged, ready for you to consume. And I'm thinking more of a mass media sort of thing, so mass entertainment. Obviously, there's always going to be exceptions to the rule. There's always going to be art house films. There's always going to be more sort of hardcore games or interactive experiences that are going for a very different market. But what I'm talking about here is really just the mass market, what most people are going to be after. So by keeping things about 80% real, what it allows for is an audience, when they look at whatever it is that you're creating, that they have a better point of reference, that they know, oh, if this design is, this is the design where it sits on the timeline, because it's based on something real, they're more able to relate back to what the original point was, as opposed to this being, let's say, way further down, and then for an audience to get really confused. Because the very simple thing is, you can design a telephone to look like whatever you want. This could be a telephone, this could be a telephone or a communication device, right? Anything could be that. But this, as an audience, you've probably got to spend about 2 minutes to explain to them what it is, and every time it comes up again, you're gonna have to explain it again. But if you put this in front of an audience, you don't have to explain anything. Your audience already knows that this is some form of communication device. It's very simple, it's very straightforward, right? And it saves time. It's a shorthand almost. So you just want to make sure that, at least in my opinion, you want to make sure that you're cutting to this 80%, so that things are still relatable between what you're designing and what the audience is familiar with. So the same process broken down here as well. I have my main reference, or my hero reference, over here. That's the overall feel that, in terms of the armor that I want my character to have. I want this combination of hard surface, soft surface, and then something in between in terms of that chainmail. And I love this idea of not composite material, but mixed materials, right? This idea of having multiple materials mixed in together just makes for, in my opinion, a really interesting design, and something that as an interactive element is going to be quite interesting. Because we still want, at the end of the day, for this character to feel like they're human, and that they're wearing equipment, that it's still a person underneath. And so being able to show soft material, hard material, right, even exposed flesh or exposed skin, that can be really interesting, as opposed to sort of your classic knight, right? Your classic Gothic plate, full Gothic plate knight. It's all hard surface, and unfortunately, it looks very cool, but if unintentionally, it might start to trigger in some people's minds an idea of a robot or something that's a little bit too powerful, and a little bit harder to relate. So this is what I'm trying to go for here. This idea of mixed materials, right? So something soft, something hard, and then a couple other design elements like this. I thought was quite cool. This sort of tilting plate. This I thought was quite interesting, where you have the armor that comes down to protect the thigh, the knee, a little bit of the shin, but really on the ground from then on into the main shins and the feet, it's just leather. It's just leather boots to allow for maneuverability. This sort of golden age of exploration armor or equipment style is also quite interesting, where with the change of weaponry, you didn't really need that much protection anymore. So it became more about comfort. It became more, definitely for our mercenaries over here, our German mercenaries, it definitely became, quite a bit of flamboyance to it. It became a lot about fashion as well. And then finally we have weapons and equipment. It's very easy to kind of stop there and go, oh cool, I'm going to draw a kick-ass looking warrior. But it's very easy to forget things in terms of, well, what exactly is that warrior going to be armed with? Will they have a shield? If they have a little bag on the side, what is that going to look like? They have a backpack. They're carrying munitions or something. What is that going to look like? Because this is quite interesting in this design of this sort of pouch that goes on the side. It's almost like a saddlebag, but this little detail you wouldn't really know unless you were looking at these references quite intently. In that there's a hole here that a dagger runs through. Right, so it allows sort of two elements that kind of fit together in the same space. So they're trying to. So this guy with his armor is trying to save space. He's trying to pack as much equipment on as possible without things getting in the way, and that's quite interesting. Things like this as well, in terms of, okay, well, if they've got a backpack, what exactly would it look like? What would a medieval backpack look like? It could be like this, where it's a wicker basket. It could be like this, where it's a frame, and maybe they simply just stack on whatever it is that they need to stack on top. Right? It could be all manners of things, but you have to do the research, and you have to go find the suitable images, the suitable reference images for these. Now, all these images, because none of us lived in medieval times, none of us lived around this time period. Photography definitely didn't exist around this period. So we have to, as a result, rely on things that are as close as possible, with the understanding that it may not be 100% correct. But at the same time, we're designing for entertainment. So we're also not after something that's 100% accurate. What we do want is something that feels genuine to the time period, that feels right, that you could possibly believe that might exist then. Because don't forget, this is entertainment. This could be a movie. This could be a game. So your audience or your players are already going in willing to suspend their disbelief, but to a certain point, which is why researching and grounding our designs is quite important. But since we didn't have photography back then, since that didn't exist and no one's still alive to obviously tell us what it was like, we have to rely on pieces from museums, artifacts from museums. We have to rely on reenactments, historical reenactors who spend a lot of time making sure that what they have is as accurate as possible. We have to rely on illustrations from either from the time or from artists who are working as close to the original time as possible. So we have to make sure that we're not, under any circumstances, pulling from other concept art. We don't want to, at any stage with our references, inadvertently pull from concept art without realizing that it's concept art. So we want to get as close to the real thing as we can. So, images like this, images like these guys, these come from historical illustrations, historical books with, or history books with illustrations in them, so they have to be quite accurate. Elements like this one is probably a little, has a little bit more fantasy element to it, so I have to be aware of that when I'm using this. But definitely, the Osprey books are great for accurate historical illustrations. Reenactment societies are also fantastic for this sort of stuff. But you just have to do your research to make sure that what you're using is actually correct. There's nothing worse than, you go through, you find all these references, and then suddenly someone comes along and goes, oh, by the way, this image that you've picked as one of your main references, yeah, you're designing a European thing, right? But well, this is, let's say, for argument's sake, this is actually a Japanese cuirass or something. And you definitely don't want that. Or to someone come along and go like, oh, I know what this is. This was a costume made by a cosplay guy, in whatever convention. And then you kind of look and feel a little bit silly because you kind of treated it as the real thing. And this is a tricky thing, and it's hard to kind of vet and verify, where some of these images come from online. But this is part of the research phase to make sure that what you have is correct. Because you also don't want to accidentally, let's say, if this came from a piece of concept art that this person is cosplaying, you definitely don't want to get close and do something very similar to this and then get in trouble because you're breaching somebody else's copyright. So if I'm looking at this right now, I know that this is probably going to be extremely accurate. This is going to be extremely accurate because these came from historical text in terms of history books. This came from a museum, so it's fairly reliable. This came from a historical reenactment troupe, so that's fairly reliable. These two images, they're actually of the same person. This is a little bit iffy. There's a little bit too much fantasy in it, so I'm really using these not for what I see, but for the separation or the combination of different materials, from the leather to the chainmail to the padding underneath to the hard surface breastplate. So I'm treating these more as individual elements I'm looking for, as opposed to the entire thing, because I'm aware that they may not be 100% accurate, or at least they may not be. I would suspect this is probably only about 60% accurate, and that's a little bit too low, because at 60% I'm now thinking this might be quite heavily influenced from some game, some movie, that might have come before that I might not be aware of. All right, certainly looking back at this one over here, again, this is going to be very reliable coming from a history textbook. This is going to be very reliable. It's a restoration of older sort of padded armor. This is going to be reliable as well because this is also restoration from historical text, a museum piece, right? This one, not so much because this is a stage prop, but in combination of this piece right here, which comes from a museum, I can kind of try and find a middle ground between these. Obviously the cannon, these come from reenactment troops, but they can be quite accurate as well. So it's important to do this stuff. As you move, if we think about a timeline of, let's say this is now. This is sci-fi. And this is the past. The further you creep towards the present day, the more accurate you tend to have to be, because the odds of having someone, who lived through it, who was able to see the experience or experience it firsthand, or to have this documented down in a camera format, right? So someone took pictures of it, is going to be quite high. As we move further back, we have to rely on books. We have to rely on paintings that we might see. We have to rely on manuscripts and other things of that nature. So as we move back in time, we have a bit more leeway. So a good example of this is Gladiator. Gladiator takes about, I think it's about 100 or 150 years of Roman civilization, condenses it down into a single movie. Gladiator is, by all means, and if you listen to the director's commentary of Ridley Scott, he definitely doesn't intend for Gladiator to be historically accurate. But what he wants is for Gladiator to feel genuine. It has to feel real to the audience. And the further back in time you go, the more leeway you have. The closer you go to present day, the less you have. For example, you can't have let's say you can't have a US GI storming the beaches of Normandy holding an M16, right? Because we know that the M16 didn't really come into service until the Vietnam War, and so you're looking at like the 60s and the 70s. You definitely can't have that sort of World War II and 1940, 1940, 41, something like that. But if you go backwards in time, you can kind of start introducing, let's say, late Roman armor, sort of that classic segmented armor that you see most Roman soldiers to be depicted with. You can kind of introduce that into a time period when they're more or less, realistically speaking, probably still using chainmail. The thing is, because it's so far back, that shift back of, let's say, for argument's sake, 100 years, or even, let's say, 20 years, is not such a big deal. But if you take an M16 and you move it from, let's say, the 60s, and you move it into the 40s, even though it's only 20 years, people are going to call you out on it because it's that obvious, because we have people who lived that experience who are still alive. We have eyewitness accounts that are still very fresh. We have film footage, we have photographs, we have documentation essentially of these things. And also it's just much closer to what we are familiar with as we are right now. So you have to be a little bit careful as when you're working with this material. The further back you go, the more leeway you have, but the closer you get to your current day, present day, then the more careful you have to be. And then once you start to go into the future, everything's up for grabs, right? Because the idea of science fiction is really a question of what if. That's what science fiction is about. What if, X scenario, and then let's go find out. So there's a quick rundown of how I use references, how I set up my references, and what I'm looking for when I'm using my references. And more importantly, how do I go about understanding what references that I need to get? All right, so we've talked about references. If we go back to our little checklist thing up here, so we've gone through and we've talked about our references over here. So the next thing we want to deal with is thumbnails, right? Step number 3. So there's two ways of approaching this. For this particular example with this demo, we're dealing with something that's a little bit more grounded, a little bit more. So when I'm creating my references, there's a couple of approaches I can do. Sorry, not references. When I'm creating my thumbnails, there's a couple of things that I can do. So the first one is I can create my own silhouettes. The second one is I can build off something already existing. Now, each has its own positives, each has its own negatives. If I'm dealing with something that's super stylized, or if I'm going to stylize it, then obviously creating my own is going to be the best way forward, because I'll have control over the proportions, over the look of what I'm trying to get at the end. But if in this case we're going for something that's a little bit more grounded to fit in with our previous demos, then I probably want to build off an existing photo, because I want real human proportions. Right. So that's where a photo can become quite useful. So there's, again, as I mentioned, there's two ways of approaching this. One is you create your own. The second one is you build off something else. Now, when we're building off something else, it's very important that what we're doing, we don't want to copy. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure that we're using this to be able to build to our next phase, right? What we're after is the real proportions. We're not copying everything. So that means that what I'm about to do next when I'm creating my thumbnails is I don't want to find a picture, so of a really cool character, so a medieval character with a sword and everything, let's say a really cool looking helmet. I don't want to take that oops, that's a little strange. There we go. I don't want to take that image and simply just kind of change the size of the sword. Maybe now that it's a hammer, maybe the feather is bigger on top of the hat. Maybe it's got big shoulder pads for armor. This is not what I want. What I want is the proportions, height, right? In terms of how many heads this character is, the width, where the knee joints, where the shoulders. That's what I'm after. So it's really important to make sure that when you do find these images, this is what you're going to do. So very easily, I normally run, you can run a search online. Through Google, you can find a whole bunch of images. So in this case, I'm going to drag an image from Google. I tend to use wetsuit images, or I guess wetsuit models, mainly because you don't get a lot of things that will catch in the way. In terms of they're not wearing a long jacket, or they don't have, baggy pants. So you get a nice silhouette. So in this case, his arms kind of crossed, which is not really that helpful, but I'm going to fiddle with that in a little bit. I'm going to grab another image. So here's another guy. I'm going to pull these guys up so we're about the same height. Again, what I'm after is the proportions of these characters. So let's separate these out. Drop the opacity down. I'll switch colors down to black. So I want to make sure, because we talked about this earlier on, with our reference images, with our final designs, that we want kind of a neutral pose. So this with the arm cross is not very helpful because you're hiding stuff that might go along the chest. And we don't really get to see too much of the arms as well. So what I want to do is I just want to go in for this one at least. Kind of just mark out roughly where his chest would be. So rib cage is about there. Alright, so pectoral muscles is probably sitting about there. There's the neck. So that tells me that the shoulder is going to be about there, but what I'm after is the rib cage. Rib cage ends about there. So that means that as his arm hangs down in a relaxed position, his elbow is probably going to sit about there. Same thing on this side, elbow is probably going to sit about there. His hips are sitting around there, so we know that his arm's going to extend down. And a little bit past the hips is where his wrist is going to be, and his hand is probably going to be there. Get something similar on the other side. So what that means now, if I go through and I kind of quickly sketch out the silhouette of this character, I now have a version of this character with their arms hanging quite loosely down in a relaxed position. Generally with wetsuits, there's a crotch area is going to be hanging a little bit looser, just so it's not too tight, but so the actual natural crotch is going to be slightly higher. Again, what I'm after is the basic silhouette, not after too many details, because what I really want is this. That is, I want the proportions of a real human being. I want the head height, I want the right width that goes across that feels real. Now, when we're designing characters, we tend to use a heroic proportion. That means that our characters are a little bit taller, or they might be a little bit muscular, and this is what we can go through and change later on. But here's a quick sketch. So from here, I'll probably go through, let's zoom in, let's catch where the eyes, where the ears are going to be. Oh, that's not what I want, there we go. Let's turn this down a little bit. I didn't really want this particular layer just so I know where the arms are. Not so much interested in their hair, that can come in later. Just going through and creating this selection. Pretty easy at this point. Let's create a little gap so we know that there is the opposing arm over here, and then we can just bucket fill that. Let's fill this in. So there we have the silhouette of our first character. I can go through and I can do it for the second character. Now, if I, for example, don't particularly like the way that the overall proportions of this guy is, let's say I want him to be more muscular, or maybe I want him to be leaner, then I can go in and slightly change it. So I can say I want his shoulders to be a little bit blockier, so that this is someone who, who's got quite a bit of upper body strength. And because I have the photo underneath for me to make these minor changes, is quite safe. If I didn't have the photo underneath, then it would require quite a bit of planning to make sure that when we change the look, when we change the proportions, it doesn't mess with too many things. Right, so something like this. Just to make the shoulders a little bit bigger. Now these thumbnails are going to be used later on, or these silhouettes are going to be used for the basis of thumbnails later on. Their accuracy in terms of, you know, that's in terms of do we zoom in and follow every little contour is actually not that important, because they're going to be viewed at a scale probably around this large or maybe a little bit smaller. So what we're after again is really just that proportion, just to make sure the proportions look right. We want to make sure that our characters look quite heroic as well. We don't want them to look, you know, a little bit short or a little bit frumpy or anything like that. We want to make sure that proportionally they look quite good. Ideally, when you do this, if you are using this process, you don't want to pick like a supermodel, or you don't want to pick someone who's super jacked, because their own proportions fit well for what they do, but for us, it's because it's already so skewed. You end up, if you base something off their proportions, you end up with something very, very I don't want to say strange, but very, very odd looking. If you ever actually look at, so supermodels look beautiful, whether they're male or female, they look fantastic. They're human beings at the peak of their sort of physical, I guess physical looks. But if you actually, you know, and when you see them in print media, they look great. But if you actually see them in person, they look really strange, because they're generally quite tall and quite lanky. Well, maybe not lanky, but a little bit much taller and much wafier. And that's because it's designed so that when they walk down the runway with the position of the cameras, that they look really good, and they look really good wearing the clothes that designers have come up with. But when you look at them as a person walking down the street, they actually look a bit strange. So here's the silhouettes that I created before, and one of the things I can do now is that if I want to change the proportions, or if I want to do anything to them, I can quickly go in. Maybe I want this guy to be a little bit more muscular, so I'm gonna give him a little bit more, a heavier neck, so it's a little bit thicker. Maybe I want a bit more of a bodybuilder feel to this, so I might beef up his quads. And so I want him a little bit taller. Just make him slightly taller. I can go through and make these small changes. It doesn't have to be perfect at this stage, right? I'm just after the proportions. Let's say we have a character over here. He's a little bit thin. Maybe I want him to feel a little bit skinnier. So I can go through and I can cut down the shoulder width. It looks a little bit strange. I'm just going to fill this in. So we're dealing with someone who's a little bit sort of leaner. Don't want them to have so much sort of muscle definition. Let's round off the shoulders a little bit, so we get a nice distinction between the two. And this is where you can go through and make a couple of changes. Maybe I think the head is a little bit too large on this. I can shrink this down a little bit. Move this in, or maybe I decide that I want the head really big. I create sort of like this weird chibi sort of looking thing. But let's go back to something a little bit more normal. So we're going to say that in terms of proportions, it's now a little bit more heroic. And we're just editing it slightly. And again, what we're after is we're not after the designs back here. We're not after the specific designs of this. What we're after is really just the height, right? The width, where the knee joint is, where the ankle is, where the elbow, right, where the hips are, shoulders, etc., etc. This is what we're after. So, like I said, there's two ways, and this one here is kind of following the second one. And for the second one, this kind of breaks off into two. There's you either go down a path where you want something that's real, or you want to edit something that's real. For example, you want to edit this, so maybe this guy is a little bit beefier, shoulders a lot wider, but he's got a really narrow sort of tapered waist. Right, so you can edit it if you're just doing like minor stylizing. Right, so I can just give him like wider shoulders. I still know that the wrists are going to be about there, so I can still plan for this sort of stuff. But I know that my base proportions are going to be grounded in reality. So we can go through and we can create another version of this character. One that's a little bit more cartoony with sort of these really exaggerated shoulders. But proportionally, we're still dealing with a human being. Up. Can move that down here. Since this bottom part is about the same, I can just copy another version over here. Ridiculous on this side, so I'm just going to clean that up. Kind of create something that's a little bit more proportional. Alright, so it's kind of twisting his body around. Head is a little large. So you start to get slightly different proportions. Something a little bit something a little bit more heroic. Now, if I was to create my own, then that's just really, just going through and drawing out a figure based off, again, using real proportions. But let's say I want something a little bit more comical, or not comical, but a little bit more exaggerated. Then again, I'm just quickly sketching at this point. I'm doing a skeleton here. And the process I'm using is the one that Andrew Loomis sort of covers in his books. I think at this point in time, some of his books are freely available online as official downloads that you can get PDF copies of, but I would always recommend going through and just buying an actual hard copy version of things. I'm not very good with digital books, so I still prefer my books to be hard copies. I like to sit things on my desk and be able to flick through them. I just find it a lot easier. But of course, it's always with the understanding that you have to have the resources to be able to pay for it. If you don't, and the online sort of PDF version is free and it's legit, then by all means, you shouldn't forsake that one just because you want a hard copy. So that's how I create. It's a rough, very close to what the real thing is. But let's say I want this person. I want the silhouette to be a little bit spidery. Details of the face I'm not worried about. maybe I want the arms to be a little bit longer. I want the neck to be a little bit higher, so maybe that they're hunched. Kind of like a tall, lanky sort of character, a bit of a pot belly. Now, if you're unsure as to about human anatomy, just go on Google, find a picture of a human man or woman, depending on what you're drawing, and then just print that out, stick it in front of you, or have it as a reference image on the side here while you're drawing, so that you can always reference back to it. So, for example, if you're not sure how the shoulder muscles connect, go look it up. It's really important. Don't guess any of this. So I've got my references over here, but if I really wanted to, I'm going to go find, let me bring in an actual human anatomy drawing. So here's a nice sort of human anatomy drawing. I don't need the back right now, so I'm just going to get rid of it. But I can use this. Let's move this out of the way. Let's move this behind actually. So I can use this to kind of work out what my muscle groups should look like, how they connect. So we can see how the bicep connects actually all the way back here under the armpit. So I know that if I have this bulge out for the bicep, it's going to go back here and tuck inside. I know that some of these side muscles here, I forgot the name of which, wraps actually around to the back of the arm. So some of this curvature is not going to curve there, it's actually going to curve back here. So we're going to lose that line as it moves back. All right, so these little things are quite useful. If you're ever unsure how to draw something, get a reference image, use your references. Belly button's here, so we know the belly button sits about the middle, but I want to exaggerate this a little bit. But his crotch is probably going to be somewhere around down there. We know that the foot itself is actually quite large. We often think the feet is actually about there, but the foot is actually in itself pretty big. So I'll place it about there. Ankles there. Shin running down the middle here. And that can be our slightly stylized sort of character. It looks kind of a little bit caveman-like, or a little bit, you know, slightly got like a troglodyte feel to it. So we probably won't use it, but this gives you an idea of how you could, using the base proportions, go about creating a silhouette. Now the thumbnailing stage of using this silhouette is really the same for whichever process you decide to start off with. Now these are two ways I approach things with. Obviously there's, you know, it's going to be a lot of different other ways that other artists are going to have that work for them. And you might find that this process may not work for you. But it's up to you in the end to put in the effort and the time to actually really see if this works or doesn't work for you. It's not just about, oh, I tried this for an hour, it didn't work, so I got to try something else. It's really sitting down and committing, let's say, I'm going to try doing this for a month. If it doesn't work after a month, then I'll move on. So we can use that sort of, and then kind of clean it up. So we could potentially use this as another sort of silhouette that we can design off. But like I said, we're dealing with something that's a little bit more grounded, a little bit more human. So, you know, this is the ideal silhouette that we're going to be working with. Now, when I'm working and I'm designing things, I'm going to try and find, if I can, where's our original reference images? What happens when you don't label? things. When I'm working with these guys, move that over here, I'm going to try and find people with the right build that I want. So in this case, this guy's a little bit too skinny for what I want, but is just functioning as an example. I'm going to find someone with the right build. I'm going to find someone with the right height. I'm going to find someone in the right pose, right, that has the attitude. So if I'm dealing with a cowardly villain, I definitely wouldn't pick someone standing like this with sort of, you know, a straight back, you know, very confident sort of posture and everything. I'm probably going to pick someone who's a little bit hunched over, right, a little bit cowardly. If I want a hero, then I'm a relaxed hero position. I might pick this guy because it's a nice sort of relaxed stance. But I'm going to try and pick people with the right body language and the right posture for what I want and the right body type. You certainly, for example, if you're designing a fat character or a very large rotund character, you wouldn't pick this sort of body mass. You'd try and pick something that's a little bit more appropriate. You can draw all this out yourself as well, and then go through this process, or you could even draw it out on your own and then try and match it to as close of real human proportions as you can. It's entirely up to you. At this stage, because what I'm after for the thumbnailing stage is I'm looking at my large, medium, and small elements when I design onto this. The actual nuances or tiny little details that might occur in the pose are not as important to me, because once I work this out in the thumbnail stage, I may go through and actually redesign or redraw this guy standing in a completely different pose, and I'll actually start that from scratch, depending on you know, what I feel like, or depending on what the project needs. But this is really to at this point to go ahead and create a series of, you know, almost, you know, really looking at a page of a lot of these thumbnails kind of spaced out, and then from here you're looking at which ones visually, in terms of their shape language or whatever it might be, work for what you're after. All right, so at this scale, you're not worried about the fingers. You're not worried about the fingers. You're not worried about the details in the face and so on. All right, what you're trying to look for is, as a silhouette, as this, right, does the shapes come through? And, you know, the easiest test example I used earlier was, you know, Superman, or you might have, you know, something like Spider-Man, which has a nice, interesting design. Now, the webs can be a little bit complicated on Spider-Man's suit, but essentially you're looking at something like this, which has quite an iconic sort of palette to it. So if we take something like this, I'm just going to block it in. And I zoom out, right, and this is kind of the scale that we're looking at things. This stands out. This reads, and because we're not going into details, we're just trying to see the large, medium, small, the high, low density sort of separation. All right, so this will take us to the end of this sort of walkthrough for this sort of, I suppose, a lecture component of it. The next step is I'm actually going through and I'll start doing these thumbnails and actually walk you guys through this process, or at least my thinking process of what I'm going through and doing these thumbnails. So here we have our silhouettes all done. These are basic sort of silhouettes of, you know, male figures, about the same all the way through, and we're going to start changing some of these as we go about creating these thumbnails. So what I'm after, in this case, you know, if we write down the important things, let's change it to red. I'm after shapes. I'm after my large, medium, smalls, and I'm after proportion. So these are the key things I'm looking for when I'm going about designing these. Now, I'm not particularly, in terms of my skill set or what I'm good or bad at doing, thinking in values is actually quite difficult for me. I have a hard time doing it, so I generally think in lines. So the way I like to go about doing these is I'll drop these down and I'll actually create a new layer. And to stop myself from drawing too many details, I actually zoom out quite a bit. And what I want to do is essentially I want to sketch out the ideas that I might have. I also have my references on a second monitor. And then from here, actually I'll start sketching out the thumbnails. So what I do at this point is I roughly sketch out the line work for my thumbnails, and I'll go through and I do this for all my thumbnails, and it's purely just because I have a easier time seeing things in lines than I have seeing things straight up in values. So I'll go through very quickly, sketch out rough big shapes of what I want. Again, trying to avoid detail as much as I can, because right now this isn't the phase for details. Alright, so if I try and go into too much detail now, I'm kind of defeating the purpose of using thumbnails. So I'll go in and I'll create my very loose line work just around the big shapes or forms that I plan to have. And after that, I'll go through and I'll start, and you'll see this a little later on, I'll then go select some core elements or materials that I think are grouped together, and I'll fill them with a darker value. And that's where we'll start to get our separation, and we'll start to get our two-tone values as well. And after that, I'll get rid of the line work. At this stage, I've sped this particular video up. I think it's about 1.5 of the usual speed or something like that, maybe even 2. I'm not quite sure. But it's very important to realize that speed is not everything. Sometimes students get a little bit too caught up in wanting everything to be fast or believing that they have to be the fastest. It's not about speed at the end of the day, it's about the quality of work. And particularly with design, some designs you might be able to flesh out very quickly. You might hit the right design, in an hour. And there are some other designs that you could spend a week, 2 weeks, and you still might not have resolved it to a level that you're happy with. So it's very important to keep that in mind. Our job right now, or our job as concept artists, is to provide designs. We're not here to provide beautiful illustrations. We can, but generally we don't, because there are plenty of other, there's plenty of other far more talent, far more capable illustrators out there who will be able to absolutely kick our ass, creating a beautiful final piece. But that's what they do. That's what they specialize in. But that's not what we're trying to do as concept artists. We can. And there are some, there's many concept artists with phenomenal skills, but on the whole, you want to consider, what is it that I'm selling to a client. You can be the best pastry chef on earth, but if you've been hired to make bread, it doesn't really matter how good you are as a pastry chef if you're not pushing the bread first. You're not really fulfilling the role that you've been hired to do. So, as I said, when you're doing this, don't worry if this takes time. Anything good always takes time. Anything that looks good, anything that has a level of thought in it, it is always going to take time. So don't get too stressed out, particularly as a student. Don't get too stressed out about wanting to be fast or feeling that you need to be faster. These things will come in time as you do more and more of these, of anything really. You'll naturally get faster. But for now, if you're following along and you're still learning, then take your time. Don't get too stressed out by speed. Speed is not, it's not the end all and be. So as I said, I've sped this up a little bit. Again, I can't remember if it's 1.5 or maybe 2 times the speed. But I sped it up a little bit, but I'll leave you to it at this point, and I'll jump in towards the end to kind of bookend this demo. Alright guys, so now here are the thumbnails that we've gone ahead and created. So one thing to keep in mind when you are designing these things is that not every one of the thumbnails is going to work. And that's alright, because that's why we're trying to hit numbers with this. So don't expect all of them to hit, but you do want most of them to be usable. And this way, you know, your client or your art director will have something to pick. So if we're looking through this, you know, I think personally for me, I know that some of these don't quite work. So for example, I think you know, number 6 over here I think is a little bit weaker. There are some elements of number 7 that I like, such as this, but overall I wouldn't say that it's something that I would use. Number 10 as well. Right. And you can also see, you know, in terms of where I started with some very sort of generic ideas. I kind of started to lose a little bit of my ideas here, and there's only as I started, you know, come back, I suppose, what you might call like a second wind, that I start to get, you know, designs that I find personally a little bit more interesting, at least as a silhouette. But you see that what I'm trying to do here is just by 2 tones, I'm trying to work out my large, medium, and small areas, because again, we have to ensure that our characters at this scale to be read, again, if I zoom out a little bit more, at this scale, for example, that it works. And that's incredibly important, because if it works at that scale, it's going to work at a closer scale. All right, so that brings us to the end of this video. So this is the end of part 1, and in part 2, I'm going to select some of these and I'm going to show you how to, or at least I'm going to show you how I might take one of these characters, or maybe even 2, or a mix, and I'll show you how to take it to a complete finish. All right, thank you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this video.